Part 2. Exploring the Past. Over 3 chapters, Part 2 will ask you to recall and work with childhood memories. This is sometimes referred to as the processing part of therapy or personal development work. It can be really helpful in terms of developing insight and understanding your needs today. But for many people, this is the hardest part of the program, and it will likely stir up difficult feelings. Please keep yourself safe and access support if you need to. Also, if you start to lose stability, you may wish to circle back to the section Preparing for a Safe and Productive Experience before picking up the work again. Group Session 10. The Child's Point of View. Quote, "He always told me and my sister that we were bad, and he would hit us. I guess I thought we got hit because we were bad." End quote. Lawrence. It's worth pointing out that there are 2 very different perspectives from which you can view the abuse or neglect you experienced. As an adult, you can look back on what occurred and have views about your childhood. In other words, from your current perspective, you can explore why it happened, who was at fault, what sort of child you were, why you did or did not get protected, and whether it was normal or abnormal. But this is not the same thing as how you viewed all of this from the perspective you held as a child when it was occurring. For much of this chapter, we will ask you to rely on your memory. We will be asking you to get back inside yourself as a child at whatever points in time are most relevant to the abuse or neglect you experienced. There are 2 thoughts we want to share. First, this can be an emotionally challenging chapter, so please go at a pace you can manage. Remember to keep the right distance from distressing memories. Accessing and working with memories is normally an important part of this work, but if you feel worried you are losing stability or may fall into destructive coping, get some distance for a while or talk with someone. Second, if you're having problems accessing memories or feel unsure that what you are remembering is not factually correct, don't worry. Memories of historical trauma are often incomplete, or different events can blend together in confusing ways. The events may have occurred many years ago, and traumatic memories tend to get encoded in ways which can be difficult to recall in a linear or complete manner. It's not necessary for you to access your past with absolute certainty in order to derive therapeutic benefit from this work. Some guidelines about choosing memories. During this chapter and the 2 that follow, you will at times be recalling memories from childhood. What you choose to recall does not have to be the worst or most terrifying thing that occurred. It should be something you are fairly sure you can cope with. If you think you can cope with remembering some detail of actual abuse, then do that. But if that seems too difficult, you can access a memory of what was happening after the abuse occurred. For example, one individual did not want to remember either the sexual or physical abuse perpetrated by her stepfather, so she accessed a memory from the point where she was in her bedroom after the abuse had happened. Also, some people find that looking at a photograph of themselves as a child can help them access memories in a more vivid way or in a way which evokes emotions attached to memories. This is optional. Occasionally, someone we work with will say something like, "But there were so many incidents of abuse, neglect, or abandonment. Is it necessary to remember and try to work with all of them? There's a lot I don't remember well, and some events blend together." It is not necessary to recall every memory of harm, which may come as a relief. What you are trying to do is safely access a limited number of memories in order to develop insight and find a way of thinking and talking about what happened in a way which supports your progress. By accessing a limited number of memories, which were typical of the type of difficult experiences you encountered, you can do what is necessary. The question of blame or responsibility. The issue of responsibility can be more complicated for the child. Something dreadful is happening, but who is at fault? Typically, the issue of fault or blame is not only complicated during childhood, but it's an issue that can hound many people throughout their adult years. Below, we explore 6 reasons why children may accept responsibility for the harm which is happening to them or around them. A feature of recovery is being able to legitimately place responsibility for harm where it belongs to the best of your ability. Children are developmentally egocentric. This area is a point in itself, but also helps to explain why children are vulnerable to falling into the 5 further explanations which follow. The words egocentric and self centered usually have negative connotations, meaning something like selfish. However, if we understand egocentric to mean having a tendency to see the world and experience from one's own limited perspective and needs, then all children are egocentric. And the younger the child, the more egocentric they tend to be. Because children lack experience and have brains which are neurologically underdeveloped, they naturally see the world in an egocentric fashion. If you convey to a young child that they are wonderful and loved, they are wonderful and loved. Convey to a young child that they are horrible and unwanted, they are horrible and unwanted. If something good or bad happens, a young child will imagine that it's about them. This is developmentally normal. Less cognitive and emotional development means a child has not yet developed a stable and rational sense of self or ego which can mediate between them and the rest of the world. Without an internal self which can separate responsibility into mine and yours or mine and the world, everything that occurs is, from the child's perspective, about them. To say children are developmentally egocentric just means they do not have the capacity to understand when other people or events are responsible and they are not, or that something bad which is happening is not about them. If a child is being abused, neglected, or abandoned, developmental egocentricity means they will experience the harm as being about them. Likewise, if their family environment is one of chaos, violence, and a lack of care, a child tends to see these experiences as being about them. They lack a developed sense of self, which can locate responsibility with the individuals or circumstances to which it belongs. Developmental egocentricity is one reason why children absorb responsibility for the chaos or harm they experience or that's around them. As an adult, it's possible that some people still are holding responsibility for past events and having a difficult time locating where it belongs. Blame was directly or indirectly conveyed to the child. Emotional abuse often conveys directly to the child that they are bad, useless, idiotic, worthless, and so on. Not only is the child's sense of self being attacked by these words, but a child can conclude that they are being emotionally abused because they are bad, worthless, etc. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. At some level of consciousness, a child decides that if people are telling me I'm bad or useless, then I must be bad or useless. If I weren't so bad or useless, people wouldn't treat me this way. Therefore, it must be my fault that people hurt me. We are not suggesting that children who are harmed make these connections in such a clear fashion, but all of this can feel true to them. Physical abuse can convey indirectly to the child that they are bad. If I am being physically harmed, then I must be a bad child who deserves to be hurt. If I were good or acceptable, perhaps I wouldn't get hurt. Therefore, I must be bad. In some cases of sexual abuse, a manipulative abuser will induct the child into believing they are participating in the abuse. The child may know on some level that what is occurring is wrong, and they incorrectly accept or share blame or shame for the acts. Even when sexual abuse is completely coercive and based on threats the perpetrator makes, just being involved in these acts can leave the child feeling shame and a sense of badness. One of the most common reasons children don't talk about sexual abuse is because they are afraid others will blame them or think that they are dirty or shameful. Those who sexually abuse may use this issue to their advantage. Lacking a basis for comparison. An adult has the advantage of being able to compare their family environments or childhood experiences to other frames of reference. In this way, they can see that what was happening during their childhood was not normal or right. But as a child, they usually lacked a basis for comparison. The frame of reference they had was simply the childhood environment they knew. If you ask a person what they thought about childhood events, they often say something like, "That's just how it was," or "I just thought that was normal." So, depending on the individual, what might have been normal could have been getting punched, watching your father terrify your mother, being screamed at, having your stepfather put you on his knee and molest you, being left alone for 3 days while your parents go on a bender, and so on. We might call this the normalization of the pathological. In other words, a child believes that what is pathological is normal. How does all of this relate to the issue of blame or responsibility? Without a basis of comparison, children can become identified with all the chaos, neglect, and violence in the family environment. As a child, they cannot stand outside the family environment and say, "This is wrong, and I should not be a part of this. It's not my fault that I got born into this. I deserve to have very different experiences." Instead, as a member of this family, they absorbed some or much of the blame for the chaos and pain that was going on. In some instances, abusive and neglectful adults will prevent children from having experiences which would help them understand how pathological their own family is. Barbara experienced physical and emotional abuse, and she put it like this, quote, "I was never allowed to have friends visit my house, and I was rarely allowed to go to other kids' homes either. And my dad never let me join clubs after school. I thought this was happening because I was being punished for things I had done." End quote. But I didn't stop the abuse from happening. Steve is a 38-year-old man who struggles with depression and bouts of anger, which can land him in trouble at work and with friends. His stepfather physically and emotionally abused him, his younger sister, and his mother throughout his childhood. Steve is a big man, but he can be reduced to tears when he talks about what happened. He minimizes the effect of abuse on himself, but what tears him up is the recurrent thought that he was supposed to have stopped his stepfather from hurting his mother and sister. Quote, "I should have protected them," end quote, he says. He feels responsible, and it's difficult for him to appreciate how little power he had to stop what was happening. Feeling personally responsible is also common in cases of sexual abuse. We mentioned Marie, a vulnerable girl due to years of emotional neglect. When a group of neighborhood boys in their early 20s paid attention to her when she was 13, she was quickly inducted into a life of heroin use and passed around the gang as a sexual object. She didn't get off drugs and extricate herself from the gang until she was 17, by which time she had been badly traumatized by her experiences. What is striking, however, is how insistent Marie is that these experiences were her fault. Quote, I was the one that took the drugs and spent time with the gang, end quote, she says. It's hard for her to appreciate how vulnerable she was at the age of 13. It's really difficult for people like Steve and Marie to appreciate how powerless they were to stop the abuse. Children are physically smaller, far less experienced, and often dependent on the very people who were hurting or neglecting them. Despite the facts, many can still feel guilty or ashamed that they didn't somehow stop abusers from hurting them or others they cared about. Managing anticipatory fear. Anticipatory fear is what we feel when we are anticipating something harmful happening to us. Anticipatory fear is common with physical or sexual abuse, which occurs on a regular basis. Because there is a pattern of when they are going to get abused, a child feels frightened in the lead up to the abuse. To get the experience over and done with, some children will initiate the abusive experience by approaching or antagonizing the abuser. Juliet was sexually abused by an uncle. Quote, my mother would send me to my uncle's when she was out. I knew he was going to sexually abuse me, and that was really scary. But sometimes he wouldn't abuse me for a while, and that was an awful time. I just wanted to get it over with so he would leave me alone. After a while, I realized I could get him to just do it. Then he would disappear, and I could watch TV. End quote. However, as an adult, Juliet wondered if she was at fault in some way because she had begun to initiate the abusive experiences. An important aspect of her recovery meant understanding that she was just trying to take some control and manage her anticipatory fear. She was in no way responsible for the abuse. While Juliet's experience of sexual abuse has served as an example, managing anticipatory fear can operate in much the same way concerning physical or emotional abuse, which occurs on a predictable basis. The need to protect those who harmed you. Sometimes the issue of blame is confusing for children because they feel a need to protect those who caused harm or to rationalize their behavior. Children have a strong evolutionary need to bond with an adult, usually a parent. This desire to bond is based on our need for survival. But what if the adult you are meant to bond with is neglecting or hurting you? It's intolerable for many children to accept the reality of what is happening, so they will find ways to protect those harming them or rationalize their behavior. Tim experienced physical and emotional neglect, and he described things as follows. Quote, when I was a kid, I didn't have a father, and my mom was drunk every day. I'd get home from school, and she'd be passed out or just gone somewhere, and you didn't know when she'd be back. When the social workers would talk to me at school or at home, I always tried to tell them what a good mom I had. I actually believed it when I told them, and I was mad at them for saying bad things about my mom. I guess I just didn't want to believe I had a rubbish mom. End quote. For some children, locating responsibility with those who are abusing or neglecting them is too scary a proposition. You only get one biological set of parents and one family of origin. For some children, it's just intolerable to accept that these people are hurtful or neglectful and that they are responsible for it. That would mean accepting that you are not loved or cared for properly. It's too awful to imagine. So some children find ways of believing it's not true. They might rationalize the abuser's behavior, or they might accept the blame for the abuser's behavior. For some children, seeing themselves as bad or inadequate is a better solution than believing they have parents or family that can't care for or protect them properly. Even as adults, people we work with will often tell us they feel guilty for saying anything negative about those who were hurting or neglecting them. It feels like a betrayal. Exercise 1. Exploring the child's view of responsibility or blame. Please pause the audio and complete Exercise 1 in the guidebook. Responsibility and vulnerability. Robert's moment of insight. At age 58, Robert struggles with significant psychological difficulties, including social anxiety, somatizing, or expressing trauma through the body, and very poor self-esteem. The extent of his problems are understandable given his experience of serious physical and sexual abuse, emotional neglect, and abandonment. His parents paid little attention to him. He was in and out of foster care, and he was sexually abused by 3 different perpetrators. What really stands out is his need for self-denigration. Robert frequently says, quote, "It must have been my fault because I was hurt by so many different people. I must have given off some sort of signal. I was so needy. I craved attention and I wanted someone to love me. I put myself in positions where people could abuse me. I invited the abuse." End quote. When you try and talk with Robert about how power must have worked between him as a little boy and those who abused him, it just doesn't go in. He doesn't see it and keeps insisting it was his fault. And then there came a moment when Robert was able to make an important distinction between being vulnerable and being responsible. He was needy, and he did crave recognition and affection. But this was understandable because he'd never got this from his parents or anyone else. This very likely did make him more vulnerable to being abused. But it doesn't make him responsible for the fact that adults with more power abused him. For a child, being vulnerable is not the same as being responsible. When Robert was able to see this distinction, he got it. It wasn't his fault. Keeping secrets. Some children were able to talk about abuse or neglect which was occurring with people who did not know, people who might have been in a position to help. This may have been a family member, a friend, a teacher, social services, or others. However, it's very common for a child to keep what is happening a secret. Or they may have only hinted at what was happening in limited ways. As therapists, we frequently find ourselves speaking with people who are talking about what happened in some detail for the first time. For those who kept childhood abuse or neglect a secret, it's often helpful for them to learn how common this is. As adults, some seemed confused about why they didn't speak out as a child, or they can even blame themselves for not talking about what was happening. It's important for these individuals to appreciate that there will have been very real reasons why, as a child, they found it difficult or impossible to talk about what was happening. Exercise 2. During childhood, who knew the abuse or neglect was happening? Who, either in or outside the family, did not know? Please pause the audio and complete Exercise 2 in the guidebook. Exercise 3. Why did you believe you had to keep abuse or neglect secret? Please pause the audio and complete exercise 3 in the guidebook. Sexual abuse and secret keeping. In certain respects, the experience of sexual abuse overlaps with physical and emotional abuse. All of these forms of abuse tend to involve distress and confusion, have a damaging effect on the child's self-concept, and lead to psychological problems in later life. However, while secret keeping can coincide with physical and emotional abuse, this issue can be especially relevant concerning sexual abuse. In many instances of sexual abuse, there were only two people who knew that abuse was occurring: the child and the abuser. This often occurs because a perpetrator manages to groom, isolate, and sexually abuse a child. Sometimes those who experience child sexual abuse can tell someone what is happening, but it is very common for children to keep sexual abuse secret. There are many reasons why this can occur, including 1. The abuser has threatened the child. 2. The child is frightened that others won't believe them. 3. The child is neglected and imagines that no one will care or help. 4. The child feels inappropriately ashamed of what is happening. 5. A child is taught or acquires the idea that they are participating and are frightened that others will blame them. 6. The child accepts gifts or other incentives and so imagines they are culpable. The unique stigma attached to childhood sexual abuse has often meant that the secret is kept well into adulthood. This can make getting help for sexual abuse especially difficult. However, the profile of historic sexual abuse has been raised substantially in the media more recently, which hopefully will help reduce stigma and allow more people to seek help. The exercise below is for anyone who experienced sexual abuse. Exercise 4: Sexual abuse and secret keeping. If you experienced sexual abuse and felt you had to keep it secret, please describe why you believed, from the child's perspective, you had to do this. Please pause the audio and complete exercise 4 in the guidebook. Indirect ways of telling about abuse or neglect. You may have felt you had to keep what was happening a secret from many people, but the trauma you experienced will have expressed itself in ways other than words. We mentioned temperament earlier, the biological bit you were born with. Depending on temperament, maybe you had a tendency to express the effects of the trauma outwardly through your behavior. Or maybe you had a tendency to experience the effects of the trauma inwardly, i.e., through your body, emotions, or thoughts. Indirect ways of telling about the abuse tend to relate to age. Exercise 5: Indirect ways of telling. Please pause the audio and complete exercise 5 in the guidebook. There is often a sad, vicious cycle which abused or neglected children find themselves in. Because it seemed impossible to talk about it, the abuse got expressed in indirect ways. But many of these indirect ways of telling lead other children or adults to perceive the child as either naughty, difficult, or odd. And so the child may find that adults or children are rejecting or harsh with them. This is really unfair. Communicating with yourself as a child. This chapter may have helped you access what it was like for you as a child. You have been encouraged to see the world through the eyes of yourself as a child, to make contact with the thoughts and feelings you experienced as a child. You may have discovered that you blamed yourself. You may have discovered that you felt you had to keep painful secrets. You explored the indirect and painful ways the trauma got expressed. Along the way, you may have discovered some feelings of compassion for this kid who had such a rough time. We close this chapter with an exercise which may allow you to heal some of the hurt that you experienced as a child. Exercise 6. Talking to yourself as a child. Please pause the audio and complete exercise 6 in the guidebook. And when you've completed exercise 6, this will end the audio for the chapter on the child's point of view.